There are no coincidences in the kingdom of God, only divine appointments. If you have found yourself here, reading these words, then know this: you were meant to. You have been led to this moment, not by chance, but by the unseen hand of the one who knows your heart, struggles, and silent prayers. Perhaps you have felt alone, cast aside, wandering through the wilderness of waiting. The ache of rejection and the sting of betrayal have been your companions for too long. But take heart, for your season of loneliness is ending. A love greater than you have ever known is drawing near. Not merely romance, but a divine union, one ordained before time began. Do not let doubt cloud your faith. What has seemed like delay was only preparation. The love that awaits you is not fleeting, but eternal, steadfast, and pure. Trust in His perfect timing, for He makes all things beautiful in their time. The chosen one's journey. Jonathan had never believed in fate. Life, he thought, was a series of coincidences, a path determined by effort and resilience. But on a quiet evening, as he wandered through the empty streets of his town, a sense of unseen presence settled upon him. It was not fear nor dread, but an unshakable awareness that he was being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something far greater. He entered an old chapel, its wooden doors creaking as if whispering secrets of ages past. The candles flickered against the cold stone walls, casting long shadows that danced like silent witnesses. As Jonathan stepped forward, his gaze was drawn to a worn Bible resting on the altar, its pages open as if waiting for him. His eyes fell upon a verse. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." The words struck his heart like a hammer upon an anvil. He had spent years feeling like an outcast, abandoned by friends, misunderstood by family. Could it be that his loneliness was not a curse, but a calling? A gentle voice, neither loud nor commanding, but filled with undeniable authority, echoed in his heart. "You were never alone." Jonathan trembled. "Who are you?" he whispered. The voice did not respond with a name, but with a presence. A warmth that wrapped around him, not as fire, but as light breaking through the cracks of his weary soul. It spoke not in words, but in truths that had always been there, hidden beneath his doubts. He remembered the rejection he had faced, the betrayals that had shaped him. Every closed door, every unanswered prayer had not been abandonment but preparation. The pieces of his life, scattered like broken glass, were now forming a picture he had never seen before. He was chosen, not for comfort, but for purpose, not for ease, but for a mission greater than himself. Tears blurred his vision as he fell to his knees. "Why me?" "Because I have written your story, and it is time for you to read it." In that moment, Jonathan knew this was not chance. This was the divine call he had unknowingly awaited. The loneliness, the rejection, the struggles, they had all been leading him here. Love and blessings were not distant promises, but imminent realities. The weight of his past lifted, and in its place, a fire was kindled within him. He rose, no longer the man who had entered the chapel, but one reborn in purpose. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he would not walk it alone. The author of his life had called him, and he had answered. For the first time, Jonathan understood. His steps had never been random. They had always been guided by unseen hands, shaping him into the man he was always meant to be. The arrival of divine love. Samuel sat by the fire, his hands clenched in frustration. The weight of his burdens had become too great to bear. His crops had failed, his debts mounted, and his prayers seemed to vanish into the vast, indifferent sky. That evening his grandfather, an old man with eyes full of years and wisdom, sat beside him. "You seem troubled, my son," he said gently. Samuel sighed. "I do not understand, grandfather. I have worked hard, prayed fervently, and still my troubles only multiply. If God has a plan, why does He not show it to me? Why must I suffer so?" The old man chuckled softly. "Come with me. There there is something you must see." He led Samuel into the small workshop behind their home. The room smelled of wood and dust, and in its center stood a loom, half covered with an intricate weaving. The patterns were rich and detailed, yet Samuel frowned at the threads hanging loose at the edges, at the knots and tangles where the colors did not seem to belong. "It is unfinished," Samuel observed. "The design looks chaotic. Some threads do not match." His grandfather nodded and handed him a chair. "Sit and let me show you something." Samuel sat, watching as the old man worked. Thread by thread his grandfather wove with careful hands. He selected strands that seemed mismatched, weaving them into the design until suddenly their purpose became clear. Colors Samuel thought out of place now formed part of a grander picture. What once looked like a flaw now became a stroke of beauty. "You see," the old man said, "from where you sit, the design seems unclear, but I, the weaver, see the full pattern. Each thread, even the dark ones, has its purpose." Samuel sat in silence, watching the cloth take shape. The knots, the loose threads, the strange colors, all had a place in the weaver's plan. His grandfather turned to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "God is the great weaver, Samuel. You see only the tangled threads of your life, but he sees the full design. Trust him. In time you will see that even your hardships have their place in his plan." Samuel thought deeply about these words. Days passed, and as he continued his work, he encountered a young woman named Miriam. She too had known hardship, loss, loneliness, and a longing for something greater. Yet there was peace in her eyes, a quiet trust in God's plan. As they spoke, Samuel felt something stir within him. The pain of the past no longer seemed like wasted years, but preparation for something greater. In Miriam, he saw an answer to prayers he had long since given up on. Love, not just of the heart, but of the divine kind, had arrived in its perfect time. That night, Samuel looked up at the sky, no longer questioning, no longer doubting. He now understood that every moment of waiting, every hardship endured, had led to this. He whispered a prayer of thanks, for the weaver had been at work all along. The summons of the king. Ethan had always considered himself an ordinary man. He went about his days with little thought of the divine, content to drift through life as one leaf among many carried by the wind. Yet one evening, as he walked home beneath the vast expanse of stars, he felt a peculiar stirring in his chest. It was not a voice, yet it spoke. Not a hand, yet it pressed upon his heart. He dismissed it at first, shaking his head as if to rid himself of a passing thought. But the feeling only deepened, like the distant tolling of a bell calling him toward something unseen. That night, he dreamed of a great kingdom, its towers rising above golden fields, and a voice, clear as a trumpet, speaking his name. "Ethan, rise." The next morning he awoke with an unease he could not explain. He wandered through his town, each step carrying a new weight. Then, as if guided by unseen hands, he found himself at the threshold of a quiet chapel. An old man stood by the door, his eyes knowing. "You have heard the call, haven't you?" the man asked, his voice gentle yet firm. Ethan hesitated. I don't know what I've heard." The man nodded. "Many do not. The king summons, but not all listen. He has called you, and now you must answer." "How do I answer a call I do not understand?" Ethan asked, feeling as though he were being asked to leap without seeing the ground. The man smiled. "You begin by seeking him." With that, he gestured for Ethan to enter. The chapel was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and candle wax. Kneeling at the altar, Ethan hesitated. What was he doing here? He had not prayed in years, nor did he know what to say. Yet, as he knelt, the words came. Not from his mind, but from a place deeper. "Lord, if you are calling me, then show me how to follow." A peace settled upon him. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of something greater than his uncertainty. Over the following days, he sought after God as a man lost in the wilderness seeks water. The more he sought, the clearer the call became. Old fears began to fall away like leaves in autumn, and in their place, new strength took root. One evening, as he walked again beneath the stars, he realized that his life was no longer aimless. He had been called, not to wealth, not to ease, but to purpose, to know the King and to serve in his kingdom. And that was enough. The summons had come, and Ethan had answered. And so the journey began. The weaver's hands. Samuel sat by the fire, his hands clenched in frustration. The weight of his burdens had become too great to bear. His crops had failed, his debts mounted, and his prayers seemed to vanish into the vast, indifferent sky. That evening, his grandfather, an old man with eyes full of years and wisdom, sat beside him. "You seem troubled, my son," he said gently. Samuel sighed. "I do not understand, grandfather. I have worked hard, prayed fervently, and still my troubles only multiply. If God has a plan, why does he not show it to me? Why must I suffer so?" The old man chuckled softly. "Come with me. There is something you must see." He led Samuel into the small workshop behind their home. The room smelled of wood and dust, and in its center stood a loom, half covered with an intricate weaving. The patterns were rich and detailed, yet Samuel frowned at the threads hanging loose at the edges, at the knots and tangles where the colors did not seem to belong. "It is unfinished," Samuel observed. "The design looks chaotic. Some threads do not match." His grandfather nodded and handed him a chair. "Sit, and let me show you something." Samuel sat, watching as the old man worked. Thread by thread his grandfather wove with careful hands. He selected strands that seemed mismatched, weaving them into the design until, suddenly, their purpose became clear. Colors Samuel thought out of place now formed part of a grander picture. What once looked like a flaw now became a stroke of beauty. "You see," the old man said, "from where you sit, the design seems unclear. But I, the weaver, see the full pattern. Each thread, even the dark ones, has its purpose." Samuel sat in silence, watching the cloth take shape. The knots, the loose threads, the strange colors, all had a place in the weaver's plan. His grandfather turned to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "God is the great weaver, Samuel. You see only the tangled threads of your life, but he sees the full design. Trust him. In time, you will see that even your hardships have their place in his plan." That night, for the first time in months, Samuel prayed without pleading, without questioning. He simply laid his worries before God, like loose threads in the hands of the master weaver, trusting that one day he would see the beauty in the design. And with that trust came peace, deeper than he had ever known. The timing of heaven. Miriam had spent years longing for an answer, a sign, something to confirm that God had not forgotten her. She had seen others find love, purpose, and joy, yet she remained alone, wandering through life like a traveler searching for a road that never appeared. One evening, as she walked through the quiet fields beyond her village, she met an old woman sitting beneath an ancient oak. The woman's eyes were filled with a knowing light. "You walk as one who carries a heavy heart," the woman observed. Miriam hesitated but then spoke honestly. "I have prayed for love, for companionship, for direction, but nothing changes. I do not understand why God delays." The old woman smiled. "Tell me, child, have you ever watched the seasons?" Miriam nodded. "Of course. And do you command the spring to arrive before its time? Do you bid the flowers to bloom in the cold of winter?" Miriam shook her head. "That would be foolish. Everything has its appointed time." The woman's smile deepened. "So it is with the plans of God. You long for an answer, but the answer is already written, waiting for its season. A meeting is prepared, a love is destined, but it must come in the fullness of time, not before." Miriam's heart stirred. She had spent so long striving, so long grasping, that she had forgotten to trust. She had mistaken God's silence for absence, his delay for denial. That night she prayed differently, not with desperation, but with surrender. And as the days passed, she found peace, not because she knew the timing, but because she no longer needed to. And one day, when the season was right, the answer came. Not in haste, nor in delay, but in the perfect timing of heaven. The divine thread of love. Elias wandered through the bustling marketplace, the noise of merchants and travelers filling the air, yet his heart felt empty. He had prayed for love, for someone who would truly understand him, yet every encounter left him more disheartened. The love he found in the world seemed fleeting, shallow, built on appearance and circumstance rather than something deeper. One evening, he sought counsel from an elder in the village, a man whose wisdom was known far and wide. "Master," Elias said, "I have searched and waited, yet I cannot find a love that endures. Is my heart too hopeful, or am I searching in the wrong places?" The elder smiled, leading Elias toward a quiet garden where vines wove around an old trellis. "Tell me, Elias, when a craftsman weaves a great tapestry, does he choose only the brightest threads?" Elias hesitated. "No, he selects many shades. Even the darker threads have their place." The elder nodded. "So it is with love. The love God sends is not like the fleeting affections of the world. It is a weaving of souls, bound not by mere attraction, but by purpose, by a divine hand. It is not found in haste, nor does it fade in trials." Elias frowned. "Then why have I not found it?" The elder placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder. "Because you seek with your eyes and not with your spirit. When God sends your true companion, they will not merely admire your strengths, but will cherish even your weaknesses. They will not complete you, for only God can do that, but they will walk beside you, helping you become who you were always meant to be." Elias left the garden with a heart both restless and at peace. He no longer searched in desperation, for he knew that love, true love, would come not through his striving, but through divine alignment. And when it did, it would not be like the passing shadows of his past, but a light unwavering, a bond eternal, woven by the master weaver himself. Days turned into weeks, and Elias poured himself into his work and his faith, trusting that God's timing was perfect. He helped those in need, tended to his land, and found joy in small moments. A bird's song at dawn, the laughter of children in the village square, the warmth of the sun on his face. He learned that love was not something to be grasped desperately, but something to be received with an open heart. One day, while repairing a broken fence near the outskirts of the village, Elias met Miriam. She was unlike any woman he had known, not because of beauty or charm, but because there was a quiet strength in her, a kindness that was not forced but natural. Their conversations were effortless, their silences comfortable. She spoke of God's grace as though it were the air she breathed, and when she laughed, it was not at him, but with him, as though they shared an unspoken understanding of the world. Over time, Elias saw that what the elder had told him was true. Love was not about perfection, but about growth, about two souls aligning under God's guidance. Miriam saw him not just as he was, but as he could be, and in her presence he found himself striving to be better, not out of obligation, but out of love. And he, in turn, became her anchor, the steady presence that reminded her that she was never alone. One evening, as the sun set over the rolling hills, Elias and Miriam sat by the river, watching the water reflect the colors of the sky. "I never expected love to be like this," Elias admitted. Miriam smiled. "Neither did I, but perhaps that is the beauty of it. God's gifts are always greater than we imagine." And in that moment, Elias understood. The love he had waited for was not something he had found, but something that had been given, a thread in the great tapestry of God's plan, woven together in perfect time. The furnace and the gold. For years, Daniel had walked through life with the weight of rejection pressing against his soul. As a child, he had been the quiet one, the unnoticed shadow at the edge of every gathering. As a young man, he had hoped that love or success might finally grant him a place of belonging, yet time and time again doors shut in his face. Friendships faded, ambitions crumbled, and love, if it had ever truly come, had left him colder than before. One evening, after yet another disappointment, he wandered aimlessly into the hills beyond his village. The sky above was vast, a tapestry of quiet stars, and the world around him hummed with the gentle whispers of night. He found himself before the forge of an old blacksmith, its embers glowing like the last traces of hope in a weary heart. The blacksmith, an aged man with weathered hands and piercing eyes, gestured for Daniel to step closer. Without a word, he lifted a dull, misshapen lump of gold and placed it into the roaring fire. The flames licked around it, turning the metal a bright, molten red. Daniel watched in silence until he could bear his curiosity no longer. Why must the gold endure such heat? The blacksmith did not glance away from his work. Because only through fire can its impurities be burned away. Without the heat, it remains a formless thing, full of weakness, but within the fire, it is transformed. Daniel swallowed. But surely it must be painful. The old man nodded. Indeed, the gold does not understand the fire or ask for it, but the fire is necessary, for without it, the gold can never become what it was meant to be. Something in Daniel's heart ached at those words. He had spent so long questioning his suffering, loneliness, and failures. Had they all been nothing but cruel accidents? Or was there a purpose beyond what he could see? As if hearing his thoughts, the blacksmith continued. You have walked through your own fire, have you not? The loneliness, the heartache, the rejection are a flame upon your soul. Yet, have you not changed because of them? Daniel hesitated. He had always considered his suffering meaningless, yet now he saw something else. Through the pain, he had grown in wisdom. Through rejection, he had learned compassion. Through loneliness, he had come to know the presence of God more deeply than he ever would have in the noise of constant company. The blacksmith pulled the glowing gold from the fire and laid it upon the anvil. He began to shape it with steady hands, each strike of his hammer ringing like the echo of divine purpose. Every mark upon you has been allowed by the master's hand, not to destroy, but to refine. The past has not been wasted, it has prepared you. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. For the first time, he did not resent his past. He saw it for what it was, not a chain, but a forge, not a curse, but a preparation. The blacksmith placed the newly shaped gold into cool water, and steam rose in a soft whisper. He turned to Daniel and smiled. Your time in the fire is not forever, but when you emerge, you will shine with a beauty you never imagined. Trust the hands that hold the hammer. Daniel stood in the night, no longer burdened, but humbled. He would not fear the fire any longer, for he now knew it was in the furnace that gold was made pure, and souls were prepared for something greater in suffering. The weight of yesterday. Elias stood at the edge of the valley, the ruins of his past behind him, the remnants of what once was. A home, friendships, dreams lay in the distance like the husks of a harvest that had withered too soon. He had clung to them for years, trying to piece them together as if shattered glass could be made whole again. But no matter how hard he tried, the past would not yield to his will. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the land, Elias wandered into the woods, his heart heavy with unanswered prayers. It was there he met an old traveler sitting beside a small fire. The man, wrapped in a tattered cloak, gestured for Elias to sit. What burdens you, young one? The traveler asked, his voice calm and knowing. Elias hesitated, but then let the words spill from his heart. I have lost much, people I loved, dreams I cherished. I cannot seem to move forward, for I am bound by what once was. The traveler nodded. Many believe that what is lost was stolen from them. But what if it was simply meant to pass through your hands? Elias frowned. How can loss be anything but a wound? The past held everything I desired. The traveler picked up a nearby branch and tossed it into the fire. It crackled and burned, then crumbled into embers. That branch once belonged to a mighty tree. It was strong and full of life. But in time it fell, and now it serves a new purpose, to bring warmth to the present. Elias watched the flames flicker. So, you are saying my past is fuel for something greater? The traveler smiled. Your past was never a mistake. Every person who left, every heartbreak you endured, was a lesson, not a loss. God does not take without giving. He prunes so that something better might grow. Elias clenched his fists. But if he loved me, why did he let my heart break? The traveler's eyes held a deep wisdom. Would you call the sculptor cruel for striking the stone? Each chisel mark seems a wound, yet it reveals the masterpiece within. You are being shaped, Elias, not punished, transformed. For a long moment, Elias sat in silence. The fire before him crackled, and he thought of all he had lost. Friendships that had faded, love that had slipped through his grasp, dreams that had turned to dust. But as he gazed at the flames, he realized that every loss had made room for something new. Every empty place was an invitation for God to fill. As dawn broke, Elias rose to his feet, his heart lighter. He turned to thank the traveler, but the man was gone. Only the dying embers remained, whispering a quiet truth. Letting go was not the end. It was the beginning of something greater. And so, Elias stepped forward, leaving the ashes behind, ready to embrace the divine love waiting ahead. The watchman's lantern. Eleanor often wandered the quiet hills beyond her village, where the wind carried whispers of forgotten stories. She had spent years waiting, yearning for love, yet it remained elusive. Friends married, families grew, but she lingered in solitude, holding on to prayers that seemed unanswered. One evening, she ventured beyond the familiar path and came upon a small, weathered cottage. Outside stood an old watchman, tending to an ancient lantern that flickered against the twilight. His beard was silver, his eyes keen, as if he had seen many years pass and many hearts search. "What are you waiting for?" he asked without turning, his voice like the steady hum of the wind. Eleanor hesitated. "I suppose I am waiting for love." The watchman nodded as if he had heard these words before. "And do you think love is late?" She sighed. It seems so. I have prayed, I have hoped, but the years pass and nothing changes." The old man motioned to the lantern, which he carefully adjusted. "Do you know what this is?" "A lantern," she answered plainly. "Yes," he said. "But not just any lantern. This one must be tended with patience. The oil must be refilled, the wick trimmed, the glass cleaned. If I neglect it, the flame weakens. If I rush and pour too much oil, it smothers the light." He looked at her then, his gaze deep and searching. "Love is much the same." Eleanor furrowed her brow. "I don't understand." The watchman smiled. "Love is not something to be chased. It is prepared for. You think you are waiting for love, but love is waiting for you. God is shaping you just as He is shaping the one meant for you. Would you wish to receive something unready?" Eleanor considered this. She had always thought of waiting as a burden, a long and empty space between now and the promise of love. But what if waiting was a kind of preparation, a refining of the heart? The watchman continued, "Many rush into love before its time, like travelers who light their lanterns too soon and find themselves in darkness before the journey's end. But those who trust, who prepare their hearts with patience, will find that love arrives precisely when it should." She glanced at the sky, now a deep indigo speckled with stars. A quiet peace settled over her, as if the weight she had carried had been lifted. "So I should not despair," the watchman chuckled. "Despair? No, child. Rejoice. For the hands that mold you are the same hands molding the one who will love you. Trust the Maker, and in His perfect time, love will arrive, like a lantern, glowing against the night." Eleanor left the cottage that evening with a lighter heart. She no longer saw the wait as a delay, but as a divine appointment. And as she walked home under the watchful sky, she whispered a prayer, not for time to move faster, but for her heart to be ready when love finally came. The promise of a life-changing love. Elias had long since stopped hoping. He had prayed, waited, and watched as others around him found their companions, their partners in life's great journey. Yet he remained alone. His heart ached with the weight of loneliness, and though he trusted God, doubt crept in like shadows at dusk. One evening, as Elias sat beneath the olive tree outside his home, an old traveler approached. His robes were worn, his staff weathered, but his eyes held a light that seemed untouched by time. "Why do you look so troubled, young one?" the traveler asked, lowering himself onto the stone beside Elias. Elias sighed. "I have waited for the love God has promised, but it does not come. Perhaps I am meant to be alone." The traveler smiled knowingly. "Tell me, do you see that river beyond the hill?" Elias nodded. "Yes, it has always been there. And yet," the traveler continued, "it was not always a river. It was once no more than a dry path. But the rains came, little by little, carving a way through the land, shaping it into what you see now. The river did not appear in an instant, nor did it choose its course. It simply followed the hand of the one who formed it." Elias frowned. "But what does that mean for me?" "It means that love, true, lasting love, is not rushed. It is shaped over time, prepared by the Master's hands. You are not forgotten, nor are you alone. Your heart is being prepared just as another's is, so that when you meet, you will know. The wait is not a denial, it is a refinement." Elias sat in silence, letting the traveler's words sink into his heart. Perhaps he had been looking at his waiting all wrong. Perhaps it was not an absence, but a preparation. As he turned to thank the traveler, he found the seat beside him empty. The old man was gone, vanished into the evening mist as if he had never been there. But his words remained, echoing in Elias's heart. That night, Elias prayed, not for his waiting to end, but for the wisdom to trust in God's perfect timing. And for the first time in years he felt peace, knowing that love was not far off. It was simply being shaped, like the river beyond the hill, flowing steadily toward him in its perfect time.